All right, shall we get started?
Sure.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mark McCallum. Before we do the introductions, I just thought I'd explain the title a little bit and why we're here, in case that needs explaining. But I think, like many people who've been on this conference for the last day and a half, I've certainly sat in meetings with a wide range of stakeholders in the accessibility field, discussing the challenge of moving from advocacy to action, and what tools we need, and what skills we need, and what ideas we need, and what people we need to do all that. And the group that are in this panel today all felt that it was a really valuable conversation to kind of bring together at AbilityNet's conference, and share some insights and thoughts. The people that you'll be hearing principally from, not me, have all got, I think, an interestingly differentiated set of roles and experiences across the arc of creating strategy and policy, implementing strategy and policy, and then actually creating and delivering accessible digital content. So I hope that we'll get a very lively and nuanced discussion. And obviously, please do chip in with questions in the chat, and we'll pick those up along the way. We might take them at the end, depending on the flow of the conversation. So that's really a kind of summary of what we wanted to kind of discuss today. I'll start with some introductions. I'll let everyone introduce themselves. My name's Mark McCallum. I'm a late 50s, at least until next year, white man, and I'm the business development director at Code Mantra. And we're a software producer who have a platform that is delivering automated assessments and document remediation. We're working with the public sector here in the US, as well as the private sector. Valuable 500, who most of you will know, are one of our partners. We are very interested in and this is one strands we'll pick up on later. We're interested in the role that developing technology can play in perhaps, unlocking some process that will help us move from advocacy to a really sustainable action plan. And how can technology perhaps act as a catalyst to implementing workflows that really deliver. And in that context, I'll just finish up my bit by saying we're working with about 15 local authorities in the UK, principally in Scotland at the moment, on exactly that, where they've had exposure to the technology, simply really to generate ideas as part of a wider workshop project, to think through how they can educate their colleagues and change and create a culture within their organizations that will deliver a sustainable workflow and set of values, really, that will ensure that digital accessibility becomes absolutely standard default part of what every organization is producing. So that's our context. I'll now ask Kevin to introduce himself.
I was sincerely hoping you wouldn't come to me first. That's okay. My name's Kevin White. I'm a 50, actually, I can say that, white man, grey hair and a well-developed resting skeptic face. I am the head of digital accessibility and usability within the Scottish Government. I also run Accessibility Scotland when we're not all locked away in houses. And I'm also the non-exec director for equality, inclusion and diversity within Soccerton. That's me.
Ben?
Hi everyone. I'm early 40s white man, and I wear multiple hats. I look after digital accessibility at a UK university, so I've got kind of practical experience of applying the regulations, auditing web estate, trying to heard all sorts of content developers in the right direction, which is no mean feat. And also I'm a co-director of a accessibility consultancy agency called All Able, where we do lots of training and advice across the public sector to support people in meeting their legal obligations. And I think actually more important than just the hook of the legal obligations, giving their users the very best possible experience, regardless of whether they have a disability or not.
Thank you, Ben. And Neil.
Hi, everyone. So my name is obviously Neil Rogers, and I'm the head of digital accessibility at Microlink. And I'm a late 40s, middle-aged chap with grey to sort of pepper-coloured hair, I suppose, and wearing glasses and a smart blue shirt today.
So I think you win the award for the most thorough and on point description. And as we do that, I feel I should probably apologise for our lack of diversity. We're not a shining example of what we're going to talk about for the next hour, perhaps. But hopefully everyone's insights and passion will carry us through. I'd like to start with what's quite a general opening question, if I may, to the three of you, given your specific perspectives. Really, how do you think, and I'll ask this first to Ben, as you're writing accessibility statements and helping organisations write those statements, which ought to be a springboard for their strategy, after all, and policy and strategy. What for you are the major factors that are going to help us get forward from a position where we're advocating a lot to a position where we are delivering consistently digital accessible content?
Question. I think there's all sorts of hooks that we can use. I mean, I mentioned the kind of the legal side of things, and you could use that as a potential stick to encourage people. But I never really like going down that road, because I think I'd much rather people were motivated by the right reasons. So I'd rather trumpet the usability advantages that this stuff brings, and compatibility with a range of devices and kind of improving everyone's digital experience. So I think that's a really, I think that's an interesting line of inquiry. In terms of statements, there's a lot of discussion about kind of statements and, what is their actual purpose? Is it just meeting a legal obligation and kind of, publicizing that, the accessibility health of your site? But then if you're just quoting WCAG numbers and things like that, how usable is that to somebody who just wants to come to a website and get a job done, and they don't really care about WCAG numbers? They want to know what works, and operationally, how am I going to get on, and how do I achieve my end result? So I think it's in terms of kind of advocacy, I suppose all of these things are very useful as part of the mixture to raise the profile of digital accessibility. I think one of the big problems, and I probably overuse this metaphor, I guess, but the ramps and lifts things for buildings just hasn't quite translated in the same way to digital experiences. People don't quite get it in the same way, and I think that's our challenge to kind of really raise the profile of this, so that when anybody, whether they're a highfalutin web developer or somebody just creating a Word document, knows to have that, I'll call it a little Jiminy Cricket moment, where they just think, who is my audience for this, and how do I include everyone in whatever it is I'm going to produce, regardless of how big the audience of that thing is? If people go into everything with that mindset, I think we'll have begun to have cracked this.
Yeah, and just following up on one of the things you said about that accessibility statement, I mean, we did some research a couple of years back, and it was looking at the accessibility statement. We basically we worked with the Glasgow Disability Alliance, fantastic charity, and a lot of their members, and we kind of took the statement and got them to rip it apart, put it back together, talk to them about what they wanted. One of the big things was, in all this information, what doesn't work for me? That's what I need to know, because it's a recognition that actually there's going to be some bits that don't work for me, but knowing where those bits are is really important, because if you don't know where they are, you're kind of wandering around the site and not knowing whether or not you should be able to use it. And I agree. I think the accessibility statement as a stick is not necessarily a great use of it. It's an informational piece. It helps people understand what works, what doesn't work. One of the other things that did pop up was the sense of accountability that it brings. If we are having, as public sector bodies, and that's where the kind of big accessibility statements come from, we are having to step up and say, this is where our sites are not accessible. We're having to admit where we are not doing enough, and be accountable to do more. Now, I think that's a good thing, and the people that we researched with thought that was a good thing as well.
Can I just jump in before I ask Neil to comment on this, which is to the point that both of you have made, which I'm very aware of as well, which is, you know, to your analogy, Ben, about ramps and lifts, you can see a ramp not being put in place, can't you? You know, it's very, very tangible.
Yeah.
It's much harder not to see or to see a non-accessible document or a non-accessible piece of content. You know, and I think I don't know what you all think about this, and perhaps we'll address this in a second, but you know, without wanting to pun badly, it does seem to me that to some degree the sight disabled and reading, you know, impaired are largely unseen compared to other more tangible physical disabilities. And before I ask you to comment on it, my last bit is that when I look at accessibility statements, I'm always struck by the fact that, you know, they'll talk about how they're compliant, to Ben's point, to, you know, WCAG this or WCAG that for the HTML part of it, but almost every public, you know, body website contains a large amount of information or knowledge or data or requirements or forms that aren't HTML, they're PDFs, and those are rarely accessible. And quite often the statement is quite, you know, bold about the fact that they've not made them accessible and they're not going to, which I think is extraordinary if you're aspiring to true accessibility.
Yeah. Sorry, Neil.
I think just to add to one point there as well, Mark, is one of the things I've come across in the past as well is that accessibility statements that I've come across are I don't think have enough detail in them. They basically just, you know, sort of skip stone off of water. And I've also found certain organisations where they've just literally copied and pasted a report from an automatic evaluation tool, put it in. It's taken probably 5-10 minutes to do, maybe a bit longer, but that is potentially an issue as well. And I'm finding that it's strange that organisations aren't perhaps realising that they could use their accessibility statement as a means of kudos to, you know, to shout about what they're actually doing, to say, look, you know, actually, you know, our website is, you know, we've looked at, you know, these issues, we've resolved these problems. Okay, there are areas for improvement, but we're working on it. You know, and to really use that, I think that's, you know, it's quite important, and to encourage organisations to do that as well.
Yeah, totally agree with that. It's encouraging people to do it, calling them out, but also actually, yeah, as an opportunity to celebrate what you've achieved.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a rare thing.
Yeah.
I think coming back to Mark, your kind of commentary around about, or your kind of comparing it to the built environment. It's an interesting one, because I think one of the challenges that exists is the level of knowledge and awareness around about accessibility accommodations for digital stuff is far lower than the built environment. It's not, I don't think it's just about the visibility of some of these things. I think there's an element of some of the technicalities of it most people just don't know about, and in many respects probably shouldn't know about. I mean, they should have an awareness that they need to do something and kind of how to do it, but thinking about stuff like keyboard accessibility, there's quite a lot involved within that, and I wouldn't expect everybody to know about it. Adding alternative text to images and documents, I'd expect everybody to be doing that sort of thing. And I think one of the things you mentioned there was about invisible, or people being invisible. I think this kind of speaks to the diversity of our work environments and the kind of community environments that we have. We know that a more diverse working and community environments kind of promotes better accessibility, because people are aware of the issues. It's front and center when their colleague cannot book their holiday because the holiday booking platform is not accessible. That becomes very apparent, and then that drives, okay, so how do we think about this? How do we change this? How do we make this better? So yeah, I think there's a variety of issues layered within that. I think the education piece is huge. We're not teaching accessibility well enough. We're teaching people how to use Office products badly because they're complex products. There's a lot going on in there, and to kind of add in accessibility and that sort of thing, and we just don't do it. And that's from schools onwards. And I'm not. This isn't necessarily kind of the schools are at fault, the universities are at fault, the kind of code developer companies are at fault. It's a kind of ubiquitous problem where we all the technology has driven so fast. We have moved on so much, and even in the last year has been a phenomenal example of that.
Absolutely,
we're playing catch up in a lot of cases, and the technology will move faster than we can for a lot of this stuff. But I think there's scope to kind of do a lot more about teaching the principles, teaching some of the basics, and getting them in lots of different areas and lots of different layers.
The technology question is an interesting one, because I'm curious to get your perspectives on whether it's, you know, a hindrance potentially as well as a facilitating, you know, enabling process, the technological advancement we've seen. And a couple of the chats have talked about using, you know, both document checkers and I guess also addressing accessibility in the kind of native software that they're creating their content in. But I wonder if you think there are, you know, issues there. I mean, Kevin, you've touched on training and awareness, and I think that part of it, that the kind of human skill set around either using the software effectively, but also understanding, for example, what good alt text is versus what, you know, bad alt text is. You know, how do you have to learn that? It's not you know, straightforward. And then the translation of whatever that content is into a, you know, the assistive software, and what that means for, you know, the end user. I mean, these aren't straightforward, simple relationships, are they? There are disconnects there.
Yeah, I think us as accessibility people, possibly nerds in some cases, in terms of things like WCAG, run the risk of spooking people. You know, I've seen the comments about the accessibility checker as a really useful way in for somebody who isn't a web developer, isn't an accessibility expert, doesn't deal with this all the time, and it's just another part of what they do in their day job. And I think we need to kind of manage our expectations and perhaps almost create a sort of plain English version of WCAG that makes it really clear. Sorry, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, I've just done it. That everybody who isn't an expert can find a way into this, because I think that the danger is we set the bar really high and we say it's got to be fully compliant or we're not doing, and of course that's the ultimate aspiration, but you've got to start somewhere. And I think approaching, in my case, maybe a community of academic staff who are already at capacity to say, oh, and by the way, you've got to add captions to all your lectures, you need to go and rewrite all your journal articles and papers and module outlines and add, you know, really specific alt text to these really complex graphs and data tables. It's a big ask. So I think we need a way of prioritizing this stuff, because I think there are some WCAG elements that are more equal than others, and there are things that you know, have an immediate impact, like, you know, a poor heading structure potentially to a document, you know, keyboard access, that they're absolute deal breakers, whereas some of the other things could be, you know, moved down the priority list in favor of some of those. So I think we as accessibility people need to do better at giving people that confidence to make those priority decisions.
I think also I'd just add to that, Ben, as well, that I think perhaps a helpful analogy is that you know, think of a ladder. First rung of the ladder, you know, WCAG compliance really is the first rung of the ladder. If you want we want to actually ultimately get people to the top of the ladder and looking out over the top, and that is essentially making sure that things are usable by disabled people. I think that's the sort of the end game. To really enhance the user experience. That's the ultimate goal. And I think to try and make that clear to people that WCAG is, because I think perhaps for a lot of organisations they think, oh great, we're WCAG compliant, that's it, end of the story, we can move on now and do something else. It's not. It's that's the starting point.
Yeah.
I think Neil, sorry, this is my resting skeptic face coming out. I think the bottom rung isn't WCAG at the moment. We're below that. We're well below that.
Okay, maybe I'm the eternal optimist.
Yeah, this is the challenge. It's I mean, there's so much within this which makes it very, very difficult, because yeah, we kind of talk a lot about, well, we're going to be accessible, we're going to be inclusive, we're going to be this, we're going to be that. A lot of people that are talking about those things don't necessarily know what they mean by that, and a lot of times we're getting stories from suppliers basically who are saying, yeah, we're compliant, we've done all the checks, we've done this, we take a look at their products. No, they're not. And I think this is the challenge. I mean, I agree. WCAG is the bar that we really need to be aiming for the start. It's about compliance, but experience, and that kind of actually making adding the magic sauce, making it just a really good, a pleasurable experience. And I work in the public sector. The idea of any public sector experience being pleasurable, it flies in the face a little bit, but it's about, well, that was easy. It was a joy to kind of get my driver's license or television license or whatever it was. But we that's where we need to be aiming. It's not just, you're right, not compliance, but unfortunately I think we're way below that, and it's very hard to get to that point because it is a collaborative effort where we've got suppliers who need to be kind of in on that discussion, and we need to recognize the challenge that suppliers present to us as purchasers when they say we're accessible, but we know they're not, and that's a biggie.
I couldn't agree more.
That's partially about confidence as well, isn't it? Because the people asking the questions, maybe in a procurement team, need to have the knowledge and confidence to assess the answers, and scrutinize them effectively to say, hang on, when you say you're aspiring to access, what exactly does that mean? Where are you in that journey? How measurable?
Yeah, I think there was one that came through the other day, where what was it? I think it was aspiring or something like that, and I had to write back and I said, I've not met any kind of interface that I didn't think could be aspiring towards accessibility. Can you tell me whether you are accessible? That would be nice. They didn't respond to that question, funnily enough.
I mean, that theme of the interacting, the kind of relationship between the people and technology is one that's been picked up in the chat quite a bit, and that's something I'd like to explore as well, because if you're in the public sector, you're largely contracting with one or two suppliers who are providing with a suite of software services. There you go, an enterprise solution, bang. Is that a challenge in terms of delivering an accessible workflow and training and creating a culture amongst the people that are going to have to do that? And equally, the community of people, and I'll give an example in my own experience, the community of people who are doing the work in organizations, the developers and the technologists who are largely responsible for delivering this. Is there a danger that that's quite a homogenous group? And I ask because in our own work, we are producing accessible content for people, remediating content, we're assessing content and auditing it. Within our QA team, there are sight impaired, blind, completely blind operators who are then QAing the material, because until you see and understand how it's actually used by the end user, you don't really have a proper sense of what the implications of your actions are, I think. And it's a huge part of training the rest of our group, seeing how those QA team members, function, and what they throw back as not really delivering, a truly accessible end product. So I'd be very interested in your collective views on that. Perhaps Kevin can kick off. as someone who might be buying, doing massive software licenses with large conglomerates who may or may not be on this call, and
Yeah,
certainly
I mean,
present at
it is a problem. I mean, I think so. There's a number of things. I mean, the procurement process within the public sector is by nature very. It tries to be open and transparent and fair in how we approach it. We're spending public money. We have to ensure that we follow that process very tightly. That lends itself to a number of problems. So, for example, it's very hard for us to demo products because how do you ensure a fair evaluation of every product that you've demoed? But it's also very hard to assess the accessibility of a product solely based on the word of the supplier, because we know from experience that they don't necessarily give us the full picture. I'm being very diplomatic here. More often than not, what happens is you have someone who is selling a product saying, yes, it's accessible, and someone who is buying a product saying, great, that's accessible. And neither one quite knows exactly what they're talking about. And that's a problem because we're not arming people to ask the right questions, but we're also in a situation where we don't necessarily appreciate, or the sellers don't necessarily appreciate exactly the extent to which we want it to be accessible. They kind of say one thing, but in actual fact, it's something else. And I think that's difficult. I think the other thing, Mark, that you kind of alluded to was actually having disabled people involved in the development process. Yeah, diverse workforce. We know that there's a connection between poverty and disability. A lot of that is to do with actual the workplace and getting people into the workplace and having workplaces appreciate the assets that disabled people can bring to their environments and the value that they bring and how they enrich that organization. And I think the other one is actually letting people see how accessibility causes problems for people. I mean, straightforward usability testing with disabled participants. We try to do that and get senior stakeholders in and observe the frustration, the anger, the resignation to a certain extent that using these products kind of causes with some people, and bring about change that way. It's kind of making people aware, actually, this does have an impact. It's not just a case of, well, how many people are affected, or really, well, there's a phone line. This has an impact on people's independence, on their sense of worth as a person. We can't ignore this sort of stuff. And that's ignoring even the idea that actually good accessibility just makes for better products, plain and simple.
I think also to add to that as well is that the sort of the idea that suppliers and providers of products that on the one hand they can provide the means to help the heavy lifting with a good majority of a number of issues, but there's always the fact that you can't just rely on automated services, etc., and tools to sort out a particular problem. You do ultimately need to have manual intervention in there somewhere, whether it's a trained accessibility expert or at least somebody that's got an understanding of WCAG guidelines, web content accessibility guidelines, and it's that sort of trade-off between automation and the manual side of things, when really actually you need both. And I think that's an important concept for people to really kind of get to grips with.
Can I just on the procurement question, particularly around third-party systems, I find it amazing. I know we spoke about this before, but how is it that we wouldn't let companies give us their aspirational woolliness around anything like data protection or any of those other things, but with accessibility we're less confident in demanding this, it seems, and there's no a kind of accredited kind of measure that some charter mark that we can ask people to demonstrate. So it's all on us to kind of wheel out the kind of answers from people, and we have to grill them in the right way. And it feels like that should all be long settled by the time somebody gets to the procurement stage or tendering stage. And I wonder, why aren't we looking at sort of, I'm pretty sure there's Cyber Essentials is something that G Cloud, the government procurement thing, uses for data protection, approval to show that companies have met that certain benchmark. So why on earth can't we develop something similar for accessibility? Because it is an awful lot of duplication of effort if we're all looking at buying very similar platforms from the same suppliers, and we're all doing our own accessibility kind of evaluation of them. I mean, a lot of that should be done and dusted by the time it gets to us, and we just need to worry about what we're going to do to that platform and system that could mess it up in-house, so it's more of a partnership with the suppliers rather than feeling like this slightly adversarial game of cat and mouse that we have to play.
I was going to
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. I mean, that sense of adversarial approach with suppliers. I mean, I know myself, I don't trust anybody that says our product is accessible. I mean, and time and again, my lack of trust has been absolutely absolutely supported. And that's a difficult situation to be in, because it does require a lot of effort on our part to assess the quality of these products. I mean, I know there's an assumption about things like G-Cloud that any product that's on G-Cloud has gone through a level of assurance, but it hasn't. And there are reasons for that. I mean, it's a difficult, expensive process to do, but we should still. I think there's something that we need to be thinking about. Well, actually, how do we improve that? How do we stop every single organization having to do an accessibility audit of MS Forms or whatever? I know so I'm part of a cross-government heads of accessibility group, and one of the things we're trying to do is actually try and share some of these accessibility reports and reviews and audits on kind of some of the enterprise level products, just so that, I mean, none of our teams are that big. So if somebody has got an audit of that, that's great. Then we can kind of then use that. There are problems with that, though. I mean, that's like, well, is that a fair procurement assessment if we've got an accessibility audit of one of the products that we're potentially procuring, but not either of the others? Probably not. No. So we're really, it's really hard to get this right. It's really hard to kind of do it at the scale that we're talking about. But I agree, we've got a problem because we have got an adversarial situation. We don't trust what suppliers are telling us.
One point I'd make, I want to come back to the question of engaging digital accessibility with the wider sort of disability and engagement and inclusive question from Neil's experience. But our platform is not 100% accessible. Why? Because someone's got to be able to look at an image to write alt text for it. There are always going to be certain kind of caveats and kind of real-time challenges to delivering that, which we have to face up to. As just a point I'd make. But Neil, you're actually working with some disabled workforce, training them to create accessible content. And I'd be interested in your perspective on how, the drive towards digital accessibility is able to facilitate or engage with the wider question of digital inclusion and equity.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question, Mark. I think from certainly from my point of view, the pilot project that I'm working on and setting up is bringing in specifically autistic people at the moment to be trained up and provided with work experience to remediate PDF documents. And I think that one of the things that we're finding is it's the time that it takes to do this is it's fairly substantial, but we're working with people with multiple disabilities in terms of neurodivergent or neurodiverse issues. So as I say, we're working with those who are autistic, also those who are dyslexic, and others that perhaps have social interaction issues. So in terms of broadening it out to the wider community, and in terms of digital inclusion, it's working initially with neurodivergent candidates, but with the aim of moving towards bringing in other disabilities as well. So, like you say, I mean, certainly with the Code Mantra platform, is that you'd need someone who can see, for example, an image to actually be able to type in the alternative text. But we're working to try to train up as many different people as we can with different disabilities, but we're starting in the neurodiverse remit first. So hopefully that gives you a brief overview.
Yeah. I think one of the questions that I wanted to ask, and we touched on it a second ago in terms of what's achievable, is really the question of incrementalism. You know, the old eating the elephant question. You know, how do we start and where do we go? And something that I'm very conscious of in the conversations that I've had, and it was sparked by the comment that, you know, accessible content is better content. We operate classically in the publishing sector. A lot of our long-established customers are publishers in one shape or form, and you know, they look at accessibility, and it's become important to them because, you know, the European Disability Act will have significant ramifications for their sales into Europe if they're not accessible. So it's been pushed up the agenda in almost every publishing company that we work with, and you know, workflows are in place, etc., all being developed. But one of the things that is a huge challenge when you make this change, even though there are clear benefits for making an EPUB accessible, it becomes more discoverable. Make a journal article accessible, it becomes more discoverable, and that delivers to the journal publishers, you know, core function, which is to make content discoverable. Nonetheless, it is perceived to be a challenge. In some cases, it's been pushed in the scholarly sector. It's been pushed down to the libraries to make the articles accessible, as the publishers just don't have the bandwidth to cope with it. But they're also looking at the implications for their wider workflows and the history of their workflows, and it seems enormous. And figuring out where to start on a plan that will embrace all of this in a way that's commercially viable can dazzle them and and kind of generate inertia or stasis, if you like. And I wonder if disproportionate burden, which is encouragingly something I hear from the European Union Web Accessibility Initiative meetings, is a frustrating challenge in every single country in the EU as well as here. I'm interested in what your collective takes are on how disproportionate burden is either kicking the can down the road and facilitating organizations in thinking it's all too big, we can just park it.
Aye. So I think there's a couple of things in there. So there's what was the phrase in the Equalities Act? Reasonable adjustments. So within the Equalities Act, you've got the concept of reasonable adjustments to bring about equality. Well, what's reasonable? What's an adjustment? These were never defined, and they create problems because people then people who are spending the money think it's unreasonable to spend the money to make the adjustment, and people who need the adjustment think it's perfectly reasonable to spend the money. So there's immediately a disconnect. Disproportionate burden is an equally difficult legal concept, which I think is important to embrace, but we need to be using it correctly. One of the challenges with disproportionate burden that I've seen is disproportionate burden relates to the organization, not to any one part of the organization. So I've seen instances where a department has said, well, we've not made this website accessible because it would be construed as a disproportionate burden on us. And my comment in response was, you are part of the Scottish government. It's not going to be disproportionate for us to make one site accessible. So no, you can't claim that at all. Whereas I think there are small organizations, there are many kind of small non-departmental public bodies and agencies that are tiny. I mean, in the scheme of things, would it be a disproportionate burden for them to go through their 10,000 documents and spend £500,000 fixing them? Probably yes. So it's then, okay, what do you do with that? How do you put in something that brings about a more inclusive and accessible society without actually undermining the important work that organization has to do by taking away £500,000 from them effectively? There are ways to do it. You kind of prioritize, you find out what your top documents are, you fix those, you ensure that you've got a good pathway for people to request improved documentation. Do all of those things, and you're moving things forward. This is the eating the elephant, and as a vegan, I feel eating elephants is probably a bad thing. But it's that sense of, well, actually, we need to do something, and we can do this, and we can help people, and we can make it obvious what we're doing, and we make open what we're doing and transparent, and we can ensure that what people need will address, and that then becomes reasonable.
Neil, as someone who's actually, working at the coalface, if you like, with organisations, what's your sense of the tension there, or the challenge? And I guess the other question is, right now, my sense is that the lack of penalty in the UK certainly, has allowed organisations to kind of ignore, or at least push down their agenda the issue of complying with PS bar, whereas in the States we have a very different situation where our customers are constantly under the Damocles sword of a court case if they're not making content accessible. So there are commercial penalties for not making that content accessible. So I mean, is there a kind of push-pull here where PS bar isn't sufficiently kind of demanding of the UK public sector to deliver, or has COVID just kind of driven a coach and horses through plans, and everything's been pushed back a bit?
Gosh, well, there's a lot in that. I think perhaps just deal first of all with the PS bar side of things. Certainly in terms of the pilot project that I'm setting up, it's specifically to train people in terms of PDF remediation, with a focus on the issues that the public sector are facing with PDFs. Now, it's obviously it's a critical thing that a lot of organisations are turning around saying this is such a big problem. We don't even know where to start necessarily in some cases. Other organisations are perhaps a bit further down the road, and so I think just trying to sort of say to organisations, look, it is possible to do this. It can be done. There are tools out there that will help us do a large proportion of the work, but we need individuals, manual remediation, manual intervention, to help us solve the remainder of the problem. So for example, with the code management tool that we're using, we're able to remediate up to say 60-70% of the document, sometimes 80%. It just depends on the complexity of the document, and then the remainder is then undertaken by our neurodiverse workforce, and so we've got them to do that. The problem that we're finding is that I think organisations are that they want to get this sorted, but they just don't know where to start, and it's trying to say to them, look, it is possible, but to show them how it can be done and how it can be achieved. And so I think in some cases organisations don't even know what questions to ask even, and who to approach to resolve this problem, and that's something that we're finding time and time again, and it's quite a good thing when we're talking to, for example, local councils, where where they say, okay, we don't even know what to ask. Can you help us to walk us through this? So people just are looking for organisations or groups of people, whether they're accessibility champions, whoever they might be, but is groups of people who can help those organisations to work their way through the problems. I think in terms of sorry, excuse me a moment.
Sorry, just picking up on what Neil was saying there. I think one of the challenges there is we don't necessarily have enough knowledge about what we're asking, and this is where it comes in. I think we need to develop, or one of the things we need to do is actually build our accessibility maturity across our organizations. And that's not to say everybody has to be an accessibility specialist. Going back to some of the earlier stuff I said, it's
Correct.
not about everybody knowing how to make something keyboard accessible. It's about people having enough knowledge to be able to ask the right questions.
That's correct.
We had a massive shift in awareness of data protection when GDPR came along. I have my suspicions that may have something to do with an £18 million price tag should you get it wrong. But the maturity of organizations shifted massively when that happened. And that wasn't just even large scale organizations. That was all down to small, medium enterprises who suddenly were aware of this stuff and trying to do something to what they could at the right level that suited them. That's the sort of shift that we need. I don't think it needs an £18 million price tag. It massively helps, but that's the big stick approach. And I think in the US, their litigious approach to things brings its own problems. Section 508 is great. It brought about a massive change in the provision for accessibility, but it also engendered a culture of robot search, or robot basically crawlers that would look for accessibility issues and then automatically generate lawsuits. It developed a kind of checkbox mentality around about it. So we didn't necessarily see a shift towards actually improving experiences for disabled people. And it became very much a kind of, oh, do I have to do this? Oh, right, I'll do, what's the minimum I need to do? Whereas what I think we can get to is a situation where we are always pushing it. We might not meet everything in the web content accessibility guidelines, but we might actually provide a really good experience. It's recognizing that those things are fine, as long as we know where we're not compliant, where we have got a good experience. Understanding where we are is kind of hugely important. And again, a lot of that comes back to education, organizational maturity, and trust in supplier base. And we're missing all of those at the moment. God, I feel like I'm the naysayer and the doom laden.
No, well, I was going to ask Neil. I mean, Neil, in a sense, you're facing Kevin in this conversation because you are a supplier working with organisations. How does that resonate for you?
Yeah, I think so. I'm just trying to think in terms of the issues that suppliers are facing. It's just one of those things. I think my mind's going a bit blank here. So
I could jump in on this one. So I think again, I think suppliers are in a similar situation. They're driving forward technology. There's a lot of stuff that's really available, really, really exciting, whether that's in the AI sphere or the kind of visualization or different engagement modalities, whatever it happens to be. A lot of really exciting stuff. And it's natural almost that they will drive towards those things. They will develop something new and push that out. What's happening though is we're not kind of coming up behind and trying to make it more accessible. We're kind of dropping that. We're driving forward and we're doing stuff that's new and exciting, and we're not actually then coming along and going, okay, hang on a second, it's not working for everybody. How do we make that better? And I think the other thing is,
can I jump in and ask you here? Is the gap then in the space you're describing? Is that because the people within organizations aren't sufficiently trained, aware to do that, or the culture and the structure of the organization doesn't facilitate, doesn't, allow it to embrace what that technology is doing?
I think it goes back to something you were talking about, which is about diverse workforces. We're kind of, if you look at sort of the Silicon Valley, sort of, if I say somebody that works in Silicon Valley, I can imagine you've got a young 20-something excited individual who's racking up to their cool workplace to spend a day knocking out code left, right, and center. We're not thinking somebody in a wheelchair. We're not thinking someone who's blind or visual or partially sighted. We're thinking these young, lively individuals. We're not even thinking somebody like me who's old-ish. It's that, I think that's part of the problem. We don't have enough visibility of the issues. I think within education there is an issue. I think we're not teaching this stuff well enough. We're not kind of coming out with it and teaching these developers that are coming out in a way that we should be doing. So I think there's a challenge in that. But I also think it's about process. We kind of drive forward with these sorts of things, and we're not. I mean, doing things like usability testing and accessibility audit, we just don't do them. We don't fit them into the process of product creation. We kind of run it forward, and for some things that's okay. That seems reasonable when we're kind of driving stuff forward. I get frustrated when I kind of get Microsoft Forms, for example. Sorry, Microsoft, but Microsoft Forms, I mean, it's basic forms builder stuff has been around for ages. We've been trying to do that for years. We know what an accessible form looks like, what an inaccessible form looks like. And this isn't an old product that's built on kind of years and years and years of legacy code. It's a new product, relatively speaking, that's inaccessible. Why? There's no reason for that. And this is where I mean, coming back to the title, this advocacy into action. Microsoft are fantastic about pushing inclusion, accessibility, and so forth. Walk the talk. Products that are coming out from them should not have glaring accessibility issues in them. There's no excuse.
Is there, we touched on this earlier, but is there then a disconnect with the assistive technology that people are going to use to, consume that material? I mean, or do people not really understand the limitations of that technology? Because I guess it's whatever you put, it's only as good as what you put in, right?
I completely agree. I think there's, for people who aren't in this space, I think there's an assumption that, someone will turn up a laptop and it will speak stuff to the person and it will all be lovely and it's like magic and it will just fix everything. And I think people, they need to realize, exactly as you say, if you put rotten stuff in, you get rotten stuff out. And I think that's an education thing. Just going back to something Kevin said about, involving, user testing, absolutely is the right thing. But where we haven't had that opportunity, I think, I don't know how you guys feel, but I always feel a bit like the fun police, it's almost like people don't invite us to the party because they don't want to hear our negative slant on their funky new VR headset, and like we're just going to pull the wings off butterflies all the time. And I guess that's one thing we can do, is that the accessible approach doesn't need to be dull and bland and toning everything down. And I think we can, maybe have a bit more confidence to involve ourselves, in all of those processes. And actually, I think somebody said in the chat earlier on that, we almost, I hear this a lot, that if we were all really good at this, we'd all be redundant because everyone's doing it at the coalface in their jobs. And to a degree, I kind of agree with that. But I think things are always changing, and you kind of always need people to be there, I think, to bang the drum and put their hand up in the meeting and say, that sounds amazing, really exciting, but have we thought about, just that question should be enough. And we don't even need to have all the answers, but just by posing that question at the right point, not the day before launch, as quite often happens, then I think we're onto something, because hopefully the funky web developers and their expertise can do the rest. We just need to sow the seed.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that's the thing. It's, I mean, I remember, oh God, years back, I was having discussions, the argument, with some designer friends of mine, digital designers, and you're going, and they're basically going, I'm not making stuff accessible. It's a constraint on me. I don't do constraints, and I'm not having you tell me what it needs to look like. And my view is always, well, I actually haven't met a design yet that, well, actually no, stat stuff is really hard. I haven't met many designs yet that I couldn't make accessible. And that's the thing. It's a constraint and a challenge to your creative thinking. And how do I actually solve this particular problem? How do I make this bit accessible? And there's always a way to think about it. And even if it's not about making it, your VR headset's a great example. How do you make a VR headset accessible? It's not necessarily about thinking, well, how do I translate this highly visual experience in for a non-visual audience? It's like, well, yeah, but actually think about it differently. There are different things that you could do there. I mean, can you provide audio responses in a different way? Can you create an audio landscape that's something completely different? But that's the kind of creative thinking that we need to be bringing to a lot of these sorts of things.
You've kind of neatly brought me to a place where I was going to ask you a kind of like a summarizing question. I'm going to make a quick point as I introduce it, which is that we've worked with one local authority in London who I think have embraced the challenge of digital inclusion and indeed wider disability issues in a really robust way. And we worked with them both to understand the scale of their problem in the short term, which is they've had a government digital services audit and they've got to get stuff fixed. And then in the longer term of how do they start to embed in the organization process and understanding and workflows that will make the creation of accessible content a kind of standard output, all the stuff we've been talking about. And that was a great experience. And then there was another London authority. We went through the same process of explaining how we would do the work and what the opportunities were, absolutely kind of mirroring the project we already started. And they went very quiet and then came back and said, our manager says disproportionate burden. We're just going to, chuck it over the wall and leave it for another day. I'm very conscious because I recognise some of the names in this chat today that we're probably, and also just looking at the comments that are coming out, you can see that the level of experience and knowledge within the group of people who are on this call. I'm conscious that we're perhaps talking to people who are, enthusiasts, advocates, experts, post holders delivering accessible content already, people to a large degree who are, who know what they're talking about. But for this to go forward, we've got to, obviously all of us have got to find a way of moving beyond that to a state where, as I said, it's well, not an unthinking part of the workflow, but a standardized part of the workflow, just like any other. And I wondered if each of you, no pressure, had any kind of final thoughts on what might be the first thing you'd suggest someone goes and does to start to unlock that process? Just as a way of summarizing.
What we're doing is, and I'm looking at an organizational level and trying to give people the skills that they need. So one of the things that we've been able to achieve is, or we're just about to kind of roll out, is an accessibility champions network. We will provide introductory information about, and it's predominantly aimed at document production, whether that's an email, a Word document, a PowerPoint, or an Excel. And it's also predominantly aimed at the 80% of people who are producing this stuff. So not like stats people who are doing amazing charting work, or comms people who are doing infographics. It's the bread and butter of everything that we do within a large organization. Champions network, at least one all over the place, and providing them with the skills and a pathway to learn more, and then they disseminate that within their groups. I have a team of 3 people. There are 8,000 permanent members of staff within Scottish Government. Well, actually, 8,000 sort of members of staff within the Scottish Government. Then the maths just doesn't add up. We need advocates everywhere, and we need them at the right level with with enough information for what they are doing.
Thank you, Kev. Neil?
I was going to say, I think just from a perspective of authoring digital content, in terms of trying to help educate people to do that there are ways and means of doing that. But I think also there's another aspect here is that I'm just trying to think of an example. I'm not sort of picking on Microsoft for any particular reason other than just to say that it's just my own experience is for example, in Microsoft Word, you can create a document, and I understand that it's created for a specific market or a group of people, trying to create a document, etc. But the document itself allows you to create an inaccessible document, literally from the get-go. So it's this whole sort of issue of trying to have a platform that doesn't, so it has accessibility right at the outset, so that even when you create a document, the end result can only be accessible, and unfortunately that doesn't seem to happen. It's and I've found it in other sort of platforms as well. So I think it's on the one hand it's trying to train people to help them to understand the issues, but then I think also at the other end of it, as well as the suppliers and the manufacturers, software developers, not really realizing that because they're trying to meet different markets, that they are actually ending up causing a problem for disabled people. It's quite a difficult situation. I think I don't know quite what the solution would be, but I think that is something that we need to be aware of.
Ben, any final thoughts?
I mean, one thing I'm trying to press is actually understand like the operating model of your organization. I mean, just a really simple question of like, do you know what digital systems are even the ones you need to be fixing in order to understand the priority, how they're used, who owns them? So I think, and what I quite often find when you start delving into accessibility things, you inevitably identify other usability or other kind of general problems with systems. So I think rather than being just the fun police who ruins everything for everyone, I think the accessibility people, done in the right way, I think we can be these people that can show these lovely connections that, you thought you owned this system, but this team over here also thought they owned this system. So why don't we all have a chat and share the workload? And I think that's a really good way to try and, accessibility, it's done best at the beginning. We all know that, at the coalface, right, at the point of delivery and the point of creation, ideally. And I think you've got to know where all these things are happening in order to be able to put them into some kind of priority. And I think that a really important thing for people in a kind of accessibility role is to become like the person who teaches people how to fish, not the kind of buffer for, oh, there's an accessible problem here, we'll send it over to Neil, Kevin, or Ben, and they'll sort it out, because that doesn't actually solve anything. That's papering over it. So I think building that institutional confidence for people to make their own decisions and come up with their own solutions, because ideally, if you're the person in the accounts team, you should know more about accounts than I do, because I'm the accessibility person.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
We're at the top of the hour. That seems like a good place to finish. I'm just going to sully the conversation with one crassly commercial point to make and to share with you all, which is that we have put a 5-day free trial and training offer into the virtual goodie bag for the platform that Neil mentioned earlier, Accessibility Insight. So for all those pesky PDFs and other documents that you need to assess and audit, if you'd like to have a trial of that platform and see if it's of any use to you, or if it sparks any ideas for how you might develop your work going forward, we'd be delighted to help. So please do feel free to take up that offer, or contact me if you want to know more. Great comments. I'm glad everyone really enjoyed the conversation. Please, a virtual clap to Kevin, Ben, and Neil for their lively and informed discussion today. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. And